Hi, I'm Carrie Lund, the director of the Pursuit of History, the nonprofit that brings these history camp discussions to you every week. Tonight we have with us Dr. Elizabeth Cobbs. Elizabeth is a prize-winning historian, novelist, and documentary filmmaker. She has authored 8 books, including American Empire, The Hello Girls, and the New York Times bestseller, The Hamilton Affair. Her most recent book, The Tubman Command, a novel on the Civil War military service of Harriet Tubman, and Cobbs has previously served on the State Department's Historical Advisory Committee and jury for the Pulitzer Prize. She has written for the New York Times, Washington Post, Jerusalem Times, and Reuters, and has produced 2 historical documentaries for public television. A Stanford PhD, Cobbs holds the Melbourne Glasscock Chair in American History at Texas A&M. In appreciation for her efforts in recovering the story of the Hello Girls, the U.S. Army Signal Corps Regimental Association has awarded her the honorary rank of Brevet Colonel. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Elizabeth.
You're welcome. I'm very happy to be here.
Well, wonderful. We're delighted to have you. So this is a story that I think is going to be new to many of the people listening tonight. Perhaps we should start with the importance of telephones in World War I, the Great War, to begin with.
Yeah, sure. So these women did something that seems very routine to us today, which is operated the telephones. But what we miss when we don't understand the history of this is that every single phone call was connected by a human being. There was somebody in between the caller and the person, receiving the call, and that person was almost always a woman. And in World War I, it was the first time that telephones were applied in a war situation. I mean, that was the modern age, right? I mean, that's the whole point of World War I, is that it's an industrialized war. And so every single army, every belligerent used telephones. So whether it's the Japanese or the Germans in their trenches, or the Austrians or the Americans or the British or French, everybody is on the phone, which means those phone calls have to be connected by somebody. And the Americans chose to use women because women were the best at this job. And it made an enormous difference in the war effort to the United States.
We should perhaps add for folks for whom the concept of a switchboard, someone literally connecting is so unusual. This is circuit switch, not packet switched, right? The internet's packet switch. This is a single connection, right? You are physically connecting one caller to the other, one line to another. So it's again very different than what we're used to today, and critical then. But tell us, I think we think of Army communications or military communications as taking place over radios. What was the status of radios at the time?
Well, radios were really new. This was a time, again, we think of radio as kind of the sexy new early 20th century technology, but they did not yet carry voices. So radios were basically glorified, Morse code. And so they would allow for wireless telegraphy, in fact, as they called it. So what that meant is that you just couldn't call somebody up and say, hey, General so-and-so, get these troops over here. or you couldn't say to somebody waiting at an airfield like Eddie Rickenbacker, the famous World War I ace pilot, get in your plane, because Eddie Rickenbacker is waiting by the telephone. And so radios did not yet carry voices. The other problem with radios is that they were wireless. Now, what that meant is that anyone from anywhere could intercept the signals. And if they could figure out the code and break the signal, then they could hear what was being said. The other problem with that as well is that because radio frequencies were being beamed, even if the enemy could not figure out what was being said, they could figure out that a lot of radio traffic was coming from one place. And that meant that place was headquarters. So it was an insecure form of communication, unlike the telephone, where you had to actually find the wire.
Well, so I was going to ask about that. Well, that's one other kind of infrastructure question, then talk about the role of the Hello Girls. So telephone lines were literally, it was a wire on a spool, right, run by potentially an individual on an ad hoc basis. Is that correct?
Well, what they did, in fact, actually, the United States put AT&T employees in military uniforms, and took them to France, and they called them the Bell Battalions. Alexander Graham Bell, right? Bell telephone. So the Bell Battalions would go to France, and they're string on a wire on a spool, but they would also put up telephone poles, etc., and they would run wires right into the trenches. So you would have this crazy looking thing of just telephone wires going into these trenches. And so those wires, however, it was a very flexible technology. So, for example, the other problem with radio is that a radio set, it would take 3 mules to drag a radio, transmission set out to the field. Whereas telephone, it was one guy with a wire on a spool. In fact, in the U.S., in the West, a lot of times telephone wires were run through bushes and trees. It didn't really matter what you draped them on. So it was a much more flexible technology, much more secure technology, and a much better form of communication because it allowed you to just speak.
Now, there was a time, I believe, early on when the assumption was that soldiers would be manning the switchboards. Is that correct? And then Pershing was kind of disabused of the notion that his soldiers could do that very well?
Yeah. So, that nobody thought about having women in the Army. They really didn't. Just medical personnel didn't even actually have rank yet. So there were female nurses, but the idea of having women in as soldiers, meaning people who are not binding up the wounds of war in some special capacity, but who are there to prosecute the war, to win the war. That was a totally different thing. And so when they first got to France, the problem for Pershing is that he goes on the phone and these doughboys, that's what the American soldiers were called. They're like, how do I get this button to work? So they were very, very slow at it. And in fact, the difference, ultimately they found the difference between the men that they trained to do the job, it took them on average, I think 60 seconds to connect a call. Because it was a complicated affair. It's a physical job, and they had to be making notes and doing it in code, and doing 50 at once. Lots of things. It said the women's hands were like hummingbirds darting as they did it. So it took an average man 60 seconds to do it, and it took the average woman 10 seconds to do it, which meant that women could connect 6 times more calls. Well, in the course of the American phase of the war, American women connected 26 million calls for the U.S. Army. Now, divide that by 6, and you can see how many calls would have been made if guys had been doing it.
How interesting. So how did this come about that ultimately the decision was made, we're going to recruit and ship out women to do this task?
Well, it came out of Pershing's personal frustration. He could see this wasn't going to work. They had to build an army. They had to get a couple million people over to France. They had to direct those people when they were there. They had to supply them. And the other issue, not only were the guys very slow at connecting, but the way that telephones worked at that time is that you did not go very far in this connection before you had to connect with somebody else. And that person had to physically connect with somebody else. And that person had to connect with somebody else. So if you went hundreds of miles, you were eventually going to run into somebody who spoke French. And because these toll operators, as they called, were French women. And the Army didn't have a system all through France. Ultimately, they did. But initially, they had to go through French wires. And the doughboys did not parlez-vous. Yeah. So, that was another problem. So they decide to recruit women, and Pershing personally puts out a cable. He's approached by his communications officer who says, listen, this is the job that women do at home. It's sort of a sex segregated occupation. And they said, women do it, and they do it really well. So he said, okay, I'd like 100 women. I'd like them all in uniform. I'd like them under military control, and I'd like them now. Send them as quickly as possible. And so then they started the ball rolling, and it was very catch as catch can. But the first announcements that they made, they asked for 100 volunteers, and they got 7,600 women wrote in within the first week.
How interesting. And what was the selection criteria? Was there training? What was the expectation of these ladies in terms of the role they'd play and how they would be treated? Were they soldiers?
Well, so there's a lot in there, my friend. Should I have been taking notes? Yeah, you'll remind me. So they were selected very, very rigorously. As you can see, first of all, they have an overabundance of patriotic women who really want to do it. But they wanted to make sure that the person would be very adept at this job. Actually, the first and most important criteria was how well they spoke French. And so they would have a person, without telling her what they were going to do, they would say, come into this room. And she'd walk into a room and she'd sit down. There's nobody in the room. It's just a phone on a table. Okay. Suddenly the phone rings. Well, okay. She picks up the phone and they immediately start talking to her in French and just boom, boom, boom. And they're just seeing, how does she respond? Now, how quickly, how adeptly, regardless of the accent, is she communicating? That was the first hurdle. And then, yes, they sent women through training. Women came from all across the United States. Some came from French Canada, by the way. So we worked with the Canadians to recruit some of their women because, of course, their English to French was very good. So, and then they trained them, and then they trained them in telephone technology. They also vetted them. One of the really biggest concerns, other than French proficiency, was how secure these women were. The Army intelligence, and I went through their files, Army intelligence wrote up multiple reports, talked to neighbors, friends, parents, employers about all of these women to make sure that absolutely everyone could be trusted to literally handle national secrets, because that's what they were doing. Every command went through literally their hands and their headsets, because they could hear they could hear conversations. They could dip in and out of them. They couldn't sit and listen to 50 conversations at once. But if they wanted to find out what Pershing was saying, that was easy. So they were vetted. Then they were sent to New York, where they were drilled. They learned how to drill on the top floor of AT&T, which was then one of the tallest buildings in Manhattan. And it was in March, and there was snow on the ground. And they're on top of one of the tallest buildings in Manhattan, wearing just Army greatcoats. They wanted to see how tough these women were and make sure they were tough enough to go. And so they learned how to, it was kind of fun. It was actually very funny looking at these records, Lee, because they're like, well, I guess we need some officers here, right? Have you gone to college? You were a college girl, weren't you? So suddenly and the women are being told, okay, don't talk that way to your college friends anymore, because you can't call them by their first name anymore. Now you're so-and-so. So they're learning to salute and how to drill, and they're teaching themselves because they have a couple of officers working with them. And then they get over to France.
And were they soldiers? How were they categorized? How did the Department of War, Department of Army, look at them?
Department of War at that time. It's such an interesting question, Lee, because the Navy and the Marines also recruited women, and the Navy and Marines started before the Army. They started 9 months recruiting women, almost 9 months before the Army did. Army was very slow to change, and they were official yeoman F for female. In the Navy, and whatever the Marines designation was. And in the Army, they told the women, you're in the Army now. In fact, that was often said if the women said anything like, can I scratch my nose now? No, you're in the Army now. You'll do it when you're told. They had regulation boots. They had regulation clothing, skirts, though, instead of trousers. They had dog tags. This is the first time Americans were using dog tags. So in case they got killed, their body could be identified. And they understood that they were soldiers. Some people who read the fine print kind of understood it might be not quite like that. There were a few women who were less confused about it, but virtually all of the women understood them to be soldiers, and that's what they were told repeatedly. As it turns out, they were not. They didn't know that until they got back. And then after they got back, and after the war was over, and after all of the women, well, not all of the women, because 2 died there, after virtually all of the women came home, that's when they were informed, no, you really were not soldiers, and you were paid. You were paid very well. You were paid as much as the men. Oh my goodness. What an innovation.
Well, so I definitely want to get to that. Let's talk a little more about the over there experience. A total of how many women over the duration went? And are we going to be talking about the Army or all the branches?
Just the Army. I'm happy to tell you about 11,000 women served at home with the Navy and between the Navy and the Marines. So many, many more women served at home because they didn't want to send them into dangerous assignments. I mean, you have to remember that crossing the ocean was dangerous. You know, the Lusitania, which was sunk by the Germans, was one of the sister ships to the Titanic. So, you know, I mean, people and the Titanic hadn't been sunk that long before the Lusitania. So people had in their minds pretty vivid images of what it would be like to go down. So these women went abroad, and the number who went to France was only 223 league. So it was really a small contingent to connect 26 million calls.
No kidding. No kidding. And what were the working conditions like? Where did they work? What was the duration of a shift?
It varied. Ironically, and at first I didn't understand this because I mean that's the great thing about research about history. As you know, you start out with something and you're interpreting it one way, and then you realize, oh no, it's the opposite of what I thought. So I found that most of the women, and like most men, but the vast majority of men did not serve on the lines in combat. In a modern war, far fewer people are holding guns. More people are running trains and building things and running communications, all kinds of things. So anyway, most of these women were in safer parts of France, but some of them were very close. They were as close, let's put it this way, as General Jack Pershing, Black Jack Pershing ever got. Because they were right there with the command. So they were, they were in harm's way. In fact, at one point, the telephone exchange that they were working in, which was right near, it was at the Meuse-Argonne battle. I mean, they're right, very close. A German prisoner of war knocked over on accident an oil heater, and their barracks went up in flames. And the building they were in was about to catch fire, and smoke was filling the building that they were in. And the men were trying to put it out. The men were actually on the roofs, and women are still connecting calls because the Army had said that if communications went down for even an hour, the whole military machine collapses. Planes are in the air, tanks are firing at they don't know whom. You have to be able to communicate to people. Tanks weren't really firing, but old-fashioned tanks there. I misspoke. Some military person will correct me on that. But the point is you just cannot have a lapse in communication. And so finally they told the women, you have to get out. You have to get out of this building. Now, by the way, something similar had happened in Paris because Paris was under bombardment when the women first got there too. And again, they were, their eyes were to the sky waiting for the bombs to come down. And at one point the windows were being blown out by concussions in Paris. And the men rushed in and said to the women, you've got to get out. And the women said, we will, as soon as you do. So they were just passionate. I mean, they were passionate soldiers. And so anyway, in this case, at the time the place caught on fire, fortunately, the men did get the fire out, and they pulled all of the equipment back in, and the women went back to work, and communications was down for half an hour. The women were very proud that it wasn't a whole hour.
Indeed. In your research, did you come across many first-person accounts of what it was like?
I didn't at firstly. So I was, I did work at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, and also at the National Archives downtown in Washington, D.C. And in St. Louis, the National Archives has a branch, military records branch in St. Louis. So I did research there. And of course, it's very interesting. I mean, you're getting Army reports, and you're getting all those great files where the Army intelligence is, talking with the neighbors about these girls and what they're like. And it's fun stuff. But I didn't have what you just asked for, which was a first-person account. Very hard. Partly because the women were forbidden to keep diaries. Well, fortunately, a couple did. So I ended up finding by fairly considerable sleuthing, I ended up finding the attorney who had defended them much later when they went back to the Army after decades and decades of fighting the Army and, trying to get just recognition. As one woman said, I don't want the benefits. I want I want a flag on my coffin. She was in her 80s by then. So I found that man who, 50 years before had defended these women. I tracked him down through the Seattle Bar Association. Anyway, long story short, I found him. He had some records. On those records, I found a phone number. I called the phone number. I found some other records in California. I hired a friend who's she's a historian, but she's almost like a detective. She's crazy. Anyway, she tracked down for me the descendants of one of the women who kept a diary.
Fabulous.
Yeah.
Fabulous. And did you get particular insights from that were different than, kind of what you were expecting to find, different than the impression, I guess, you gathered from the official records?
Well, Lee, Carrie mentioned that I'm a novelist too. Then this is not a novel. It's pure straight up fact, history, the regular deal. But I like to tell history when I can in a way that makes you feel like you're living in the person's shoes. And you can only do that if you have first person sources really to do it really effectively. So, one of the two women who naughty girls kept diaries. One of them, and I was very fortunate because one was the woman who was the commander of the whole, the first commander of the whole shebang, Grace Banker, who won the Distinguished Service Medal at the end of the war. And the other was a woman who was one of the small contingent that was right there with Pershing in the thick of the battles of Meuse-Argonne and Saint-Mihiel and these really big engagements. And her husband was a soldier. Well, actually, he was in the Navy. And so part of what I got is just her worry about him, his worry about her, what that was like. Grace Banker's father died while she was away. Her brother she never knew if her brother was still alive. They couldn't communicate. He was in France, she was in France. They couldn't communicate with each other. And she kept buying him cigarettes, thinking maybe she could get them to him. Just the things you do when you hope somebody isn't gone yet. Right. But her father had died. She later discovered, by the way, he did survive the war. He had been gassed, but he was there when she got her Distinguished Service Medal, and he was there in the reviewing stand in Germany. They were in occupied Germany at that point. And he was there to see his sister be the first woman soldier to win the DSM.
Fabulous. That's fabulous. So let's talk now about then this whole issue about recognition and what happened after the war, how they were treated, and then this years-long, decades-long campaign for recognition.
Yeah, craziness. So when the women got back, some of the very first women who got back applied for the wartime benefits. By the way, I should mention that, the women went before most of the men, and they came home, many of them, well after the men came, because they were in logistics, right? And we all know you and Carrie showed up before everybody else tonight, right? So the logistics people have to be there first. So some of the women did not come home until January of 1920. Now the war ended in November 1918. So they were there a long time. But the first ones who got back applied for what all the men were getting and what women who had stayed home were getting, which were the Victory Medal, these sort of the bonuses. Both states and the federal government gave cash bonuses to people who had gone. It was America's first foreign war. They were very proud of the people who had served, and they wanted to help them recover financially from their service. So depending on how long you were there, you got a bigger bonus, by the way. The longer you were overseas, the bigger the bonus. So the women who served the longest should have gotten the biggest bonuses. Lee, Carrie. So they were applying for these things. But what happened is that they were immediately told, oh, well, show us your formal discharge papers. And they're like, oh, well, got this thing telling me to go to the train station. This saying is you're going to go home this date. Is that what you mean? And they would say, no, we want this thing that has a stamp on it, or who knows what they looked like. You don't have them. So get them. And by the way, they went to organizations like the UFW and Foreign Legion, and also said, I'm one of your girl members. And they're like, where are your discharge papers? And they're like, well, I've got what I've got. So the Army wrote them back and said, oh no, you weren't actually soldiers. you were contract employees. Now, these were women who had never seen a contract, signed a contract. The only thing they had done was take the Army oath. In fact, they had to do so multiple times, especially if they advanced in rank. They had to go, notary publics, or various, government offices, and swear the oath to the Army. And later on, in one of the times that they applied, one of the women who applied, she said, I know I swore the oath, and they said, no, you didn't even swear the oath. Now, those were people who had not even gone back to her personal record, because I had seen her personnel record 100 years later, and there was the oath.
Well, and so how did this play out? That whole, show us your papers seems like such a bureaucratic response, right? Completely devoid of any sense of the service of these individuals, and instead just a bureaucrat in a large bureaucracy.
And it broke the hearts of the men too, by the way. The men who they served with, some of these men just, kept writing letters for decades. Ultimately, they gave up because everybody was saying no, no, no. But they would write and say, this woman served next to me. She did everything I did. By the way, I should tell you that Ginger Rogers' mother was one of the ten first female Marines in World War I. And you may remember Ginger Rogers was kind of stairs dance. Yeah, she said, I did everything Fred did, but backwards and in high heels. So Ginger Rogers' mother could have attested personally that these, they did it all, and they did it all under very trying circumstances. So yeah, it was a very bureaucratic response. And the weird thing is that it wasn't really much money. 223 women, was nothing, was peanuts. It was that they really couldn't give them the honor. That's the really kind of bone-chilling thing about it. In the long run, they just, they couldn't, which is odd because there were, the Marine Corps was doing it and the Navy was doing it. So why are some people stubborn? I don't know. It's the human dilemma.
But eventually, there was some recognition. Is that right?
I love happy endings, don't you? So, so what happens eventually? Initially the women come home, they're like, oh, this is rotten. But, they're getting married. They're young women. They're getting married. They're having kids. But what really kind of burns them, what really gets one of them in particular going, was her knowledge that the women who had been disabled, some of the women suffered really grievous disabilities. Tuberculosis was rampant, and at that time, you could die from tuberculosis pretty easily, and it also created very, very deep bone damage. And women who were disabled, had served at home, could go to the vet hospital, and women who'd gone to France couldn't do that. So it was just really bothered some of these women, and so they in the 1930s. So decade goes by, they have their kids, whatever, and they start writing to the War Department and to their congressmen, and they start to introduce bills into Congress saying, this has to be overturned, these women need to be recognized. They write to every president from FDR to, Harry Truman, to Dwight Eisenhower, to John Kennedy, to, let me get these guys in proper order here, LBJ, of course, Nixon, etc., all the way up until Jimmy Carter. Now, what happens is that the bills go in, but Congress is never interested in it. This is what happens. You introduce a bill, and if it's not voted on, it's gone the next year. So they kept introducing bills that kept just getting shot down. And the Veterans Administration wanted nothing to do with these women. And so what finally happens is that the second wave of the women's movement comes along, basically. So, but the really cool part about this is that you get this collaboration between the National Organization for Women, Barry Goldwater, and other people in Congress, and they say, we need to recognize our servicewomen. Goldwater, who is of course a very conservative Republican, he got interested in this, not because of the women of World War I, but because of the women of World War II. He had been an Air Force service pilot. Those are the pilots who are not combat pilots, but they fly planes to do other things. training missions, ferrying missions, all kinds of things. And he had heard about the WASPs, which were the women's Air Force service pilots who had flown, who had died in plane wrecks, although apparently they had a better flight record on average than the men, maybe because they knew everyone was looking at them. Anyway, he really took up the cudgel for that group, as did some women in Congress. Cokie Roberts' mother, you may remember Cokie Roberts' mother. She, oh gosh, I'm at the moment, I'm blanking on her name, but it'll come to me. It's Corrine Boggs. So she, Lindy Boggs was her nickname. She also took this up, and National Organization for Women really helped to organize this. And so they were about to get the WASPs through, and the women of World War I were like, but what about us? Can't we get in on this? So the really sweet thing, I personally found it very sweet. These women have been organizing so long that they're now in their 80s and 90s. There was one of them who was in Seattle, Washington. Her name was Merle Egan. And she kept going so long that when she was an old woman, she lived in a rest home, and she got a Barbie doll, and she sewed a new uniform for Barbie, and she would take Barbie in her Signal Corps uniform to children's schools, to public schools, to tell the story of the Hello Girls, because she didn't want it to be lost to history. And she had her own brass insignia. Her own dog tags, and she would put the stuff on Barbie, take it to the school. Well, she got written up in some Seattle newspaper, and a Seattle attorney, a young man, back when lawyers really led the crusade for justice in America, which was in the 60s and 70s. And he contacted her and said, "Do you need help?" And she said, "Well, yes, young man, I do." And he was 29 and she was 89, and they became fast friends. His name is Mark Ho. And he made the legal argument. He said, we're going to figure this out. He made the argument, ultimately presented to Congress, that it's illegal to impersonate an Army personnel. It's illegal to impersonate a police officer. If the U.S. government puts you in its uniform and tells you may never take it off unless you are literally in your bed with your pajamas on, and gives you dog tags, which it tells you can never remove, then it has made you a soldier by the way law works. And so we can either sue the pants off you, or you can do these women justice after 60 years. And so they did. Now, Merle Egan, she was one of only about 30 women who were still alive. And she finally gets it's this great, great moment. She gets her discharge papers and her victory medal. And she says, "And I'm so pleased to get this medal, not just for, serving my country in France all those years ago, but for fighting the U.S. Army for 60 years and winning." She was quite a character.
It's what a great ending indeed. Sadly, 60 years had to go by. Let me ask. I know we've got questions, and Carrie's going to take us through those. But let me switch gears for just a minute. I think you're perhaps the guest we've had that has the broadest experience with traditional, history and novels and documentaries and everything, and at least to the best of our knowledge, the only one who's been on the Pulitzer Committee. What is that like?
Oh, well, of course, it's a great honor. It's lovely to be asked, and it's just a ton of work. Would you do a ton of work for a year for free? They're asking you, and you're like, sure, of course. I'm a historian. It's what we do all the time. You ask me to speak on something, and I'm doing it for free or whatever. We're here to tell the story. So anyway, it's essentially you're reading, however many books are submitted for the prize in your category. Ours was history. And so I think it's, 150 books or something like that. And then you're, some of them are easy. The really bad ones. Every now and again, you get some losers and you're just able to pitch that. But then it comes down to a really, a heated debate amongst you and two other historians about, because it's a small jury, it's per category. So there are 3 people on the history category. And you're debating, is this an important book? Is it a well-done book? What's the research like? How innovative it is? I was on the year that actually the prize was given to Annette Gordon-Reed for the Hemingses of Monticello. So what our job as the jury was to winnow all of these books down to 3 choices. Then it's the Pulitzer board that reads just 3 books, and then they decide.
And does the Pulitzer board have historians on it, or is that a different group completely?
No, the Pulitzer board is a mixture of people, because there are prizes in all fields, as you know. I mean, fiction and poetry, and of course journalism is one of the biggest categories. So they have all different types of people on it. I don't know the number of people who are on the Pulitzer board. I just don't. It's not. I don't think it's a huge number. But yes, there is always at least one major historian.
That is fascinating. As is the Hello Girls. So, Carrie, why don't you rejoin us? I know we have questions.
All right, we do have some questions. All right, our first question is, where are the vetting records, and are they easily accessible? Did they do this vetting for the Yeoman F women?
Right. I'm not aware that they did that for the Yeoman F women. I don't know that because I didn't research their records, but I think that the Army intelligence was a very different thing, Carrie, because they're abroad. I mean, these women literally are handling all of the commands. In fact, some of the women were assigned to what were they called, the boards, switchboards, which were dealing with more prosaic things like, shipments. But even then, it's like troop movements, so it's not trivial. They're in France. But then there are women who are called the, I think the command boards, if I recall correctly. And so those are literally such, life and death, secrets. And of course, these women were under tremendous pressure too. You have to know that they knew that if they didn't get a call through accurately and quickly, somebody would die. So it was quite a thing. So the records themselves, they are all at the St. Louis branch of the National Archives. So if you go there and you have a legitimate research purpose, they'll let you in. I don't know who they let in, who they don't. I have my little card, I'm a hip professional historian, so they're usually pretty cool with me. And so you ask for the records of the individuals. I want to see the records of Grace Banker. I want to see the records of so-and-so. Some are more complete than others. These are old records from, 100 and something years ago now. So some of the women, the records are, you've got more of them. And some of them, they don't seem to have as many. But, the ones that are there, that's where you find them.
Okay, thank you. If they used wired technology in the trenches in World War I, what and when were the differences in World War II? Well,
right at almost the very, after the war was over, as World War I was ending, they developed the technology for radios to carry voices. So one of the disabilities of radio, one of the 3 major disabilities, drops off. So by the time you get to World War II, they're using radios for a lot. I haven't studied the technology of World War II well enough, in any depth to know exactly how that morphed. But certainly by that point, they're using radios. I don't know how they're keeping them secure. But of course, we've all heard about Bletchley Park, right? And we've all heard about the attempts to make wireless transmissions secure by elaborate coding mechanisms. So that's what happens in World War II.
Okay, thank you. All right, and our last question is, how did you come to write about these brave women? How did you decide to write this book?
Well, it's a funny thing because I didn't go into women's history as a young scholar. I had actually, I'd been involved in some women's movement stuff when I was young, when I was a teenager, et cetera. So I thought, I don't want to go into something I personally had any kind of dog in the fight. I wanted to always be a scholar, researching things that I didn't feel personally connected to. So I went into U.S. foreign relations, and I had written a number of books on that subject. And I wanted to write something on World War I because of the anniversary, the centennial coming up. And actually, I'm like, okay, another book on Woodrow Wilson, which, by the way, I do believe he's misunderstood. And I have a book in the back of my mind. But I also thought it was a little overdone. So I thought, well, I should see something that's not been done. And then I kind of just tripped over the story. And so then I guess it's calling my name. And then the more I did it, it was so funny, by the way. So I had a major historian, a very close friend, and I was telling him what I was going to be doing. And he said, well, they can get a whole book out of that. And I'm like, I think so. Because we tend to think, I think innocently enough, that we're taking these small stories and making them look big so that we can appreciate the diversity of American history and the great things that a few women did. and actually, the more I researched it, I realized, wow, this war might not have come down as it did if these women hadn't been there in these extraordinary roles that the Army really did appreciate them for until it decided they were nobody. And those were the bureaucrats, by the way. Those were the bureaucrats, Lee. Those weren't the generals. And so I kind of backed into the topic. But then I ended up feeling it was actually quite important.
Definitely. All right. Well, thank you so much. This has been fascinating. Go ahead, Lee.
Elizabeth, you told us before we got started that you've got a new book out. Is that one we know about, or has that been announced? What's the book?
No, I'm working on a new book. I ended up kind of going into this weird little jag after I decided I was never going to write about women because other really good people were doing it. They didn't need me. I ended up writing, my next book was about Harriet Tubman. And guess what? She was a woman soldier. And I ended up writing about her military service, not the Underground Railroad. Because she too had a very important military role for one person, one human being. She commanded an important troop of scouts in South Carolina at a very pivotal moment in the Civil War. It's an important person. Guess what? She applied for her military pension, just like the Hello Girls, and it took her 30 years to get hers. Now, by the way, at least one man who served under her, because I ended up, again, as a historian, even though this is fiction, I'm always trying to track down every last possible knowable fact and include it. One of the men who served under her got his pension immediately. One of the black men, former enslaved persons who served under Tubman. So it was kind of like, okay, well, this is weird, now this second story in a row. And then my current book, I'm actually looking at the history of women's rights in the United States. Okay, I'm succumbing to fate, I guess. Writing this book, I swore I never would. But it too, I'm learning so much. And it's actually such a bigger story than I even knew.
How interesting. Well, good. All right, Carrie?
All right, we have a link to Elizabeth's book in the chat. And as you just said, Elizabeth, there's always so much more to learn, and you will find that in this book. Lots of good stuff in there that we didn't have time to unpack tonight. So take a minute and check that out. And then next week, we're going to take a brief summer break, so we will not have a live stream. However, we do have more than 50 of these previous sessions recorded. You can find them on historycamp.org. So we invite you to enjoy one of those anytime you'd like. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, everyone. And thank you, Elizabeth, for spending your evening with us.
My pleasure.
Thank you.